We're talking all about evolution today, but not this kind of evolution. We're talking about the evolution of villains, and specifically multi-villain scenarios. And this is kind of a sequel to my Evolution of Heroes video. Definitely check that if you haven't already. And I'll be doing another hero evolution video at some point. But today's multi-villain day, and it's a really fascinating topic. The more I looked into it, the more things I found connected, to the point that I had to shorten the video. I had to get rid of some of the points I was going to talk about, because we would have been here for like 2 hours. A lot of scenarios feed off ideas from other scenarios. So if you notice anything that you think is related to another scenario and I've not mentioned it, let me know in the comments, because I think you're probably right and it probably just got cut out of this video. Now, before we proceed, I do want to identify what a multi-villain scenario is, because you won't find that sort of, phrase in any of the rule books, anything like that. It's a kind of community term to my knowledge here, which we just say, oh, there's multiple villains in this scenario. It's a multi-villain scenario. But I hate this, and if you've listened to the podcast, you'll know that I hate this, because there's kind of two different things we're talking about here. So we have scenarios like Wrecking Crew, which have multiple villains on the table at once. Then we've got scenarios like Mansion Attack, which have multiple villains, across the scenario, but you'll only see one at a time. There are never multiple villains on the table at once. Does that mean it's still a multi-villain scenario? And depending on your criteria, yes, and depending on the criteria, no. So this is what I've done. I think that if there are 4 villains on the table at once, it's a different kind of dynamic, shall we say, to having them in a stack, because you've got different abilities all out that could target you at any one time. You kind of got to deal with different villains at once as well, which means you can, attacks that hit multiple targets, are more valuable there. There's just several different things which make them different. In both cases, you are adapting to different villains, but in one case, you're constantly readapting. They're always out on the board. The other one, they're just swapping sometimes. Maybe it's only once or twice a scenario. To me, what that means is that they are different at a fundamental level. So I'm calling the ones with multiple villains out on the table multi-villain scenarios still, and the ones where they're kind of stack, it's a villain that changes significantly somehow, dynamic villain scenarios. So we're going to talk about multi-villain scenarios first, but I will be covering what I'm calling dynamic villain scenarios as well, where the villain changes. So for multi-villain scenarios, we've got Wrecking Crew, and we've got Tower Defense, Sinister Six, and the 4 Horsemen. These are the only 4 which fall into this category, where there are multiple villains out on the table at all times. Sinister Six, sometimes there's just one, sometimes there's none if you defeat all of them, but generally you'll be seeing, a few around, and different ones will pop in and out very quickly. So I think it counts. Multi-target attacks, they become very useful here. All of these can trace their origins to Wrecking Crew, so we need to talk about it, but this is a flawed scenario. There is a fundamental problem with this scenario, and we need to look at how the main scheme and side schemes interact. There are 4 villains, each one has their own side scheme. Wrecker here has Day of Reckoning, for an example, and then there's the main scheme, which is called Breakout, which goes up to 6 threat per person. 6 threat per person, terrible, it's very small amount, 1 advance in single player solo, and you might be looking at a loss in most scenarios, but actually not in the Wrecking Crew, because when a villain schemes here, it doesn't add threat to the Breakout, and it adds it to one of the side schemes. So the main scheme just ticks up by 1 every turn in solo play, or 2 every turn in 2 player, and so on. What this means is that it's very, 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 very hard to lose the threat in this scenario, because you cannot lose the main scheme, by surprise. So unless you're just not, hitting it occasionally with a 1 or 2 forwarding, you are basically 100% safe. This even goes for, the modular sets, because you actually cannot change the modulars officially in this scenario. So basically, you cannot lose the threat unless you allow yourself to lose the threat. What this means is that, yes, the villains have some nasty attacks and abilities and things, and it isn't great if the side schemes go over, because, when they reach 10, bad effect happens. But those bad effects generally don't defeat you. So you can very easily just go Alter Ego, let that bad effect hit. Worst case, maybe you're taking 2 damage, but, most of the effects aren't even that bad. You can just sit Alter Ego, and you don't lose, basically, at all. Like, if you ever are under, in danger, just go Alter Ego. And that is fundamentally why the Wrecking Crew is broken. And you can completely manipulate which villain is going to activate as well to make it even more gameable based on the amount of threat on their scheme. So it has some problems where the players are not in enough danger, where they can, take too much control. But it's a really interesting basis with those 4 villains, each with their own abilities and stats and things. We see the idea of these side schemes from Wrecking Crew become the main schemes in Tower Defense, the next multi-villain scenario that, follows on from Wrecking Crew. And what's really interesting here is that the side schemes became main schemes. But in the same vein, when they reach a certain amount of threat, you have a bad thing happen and they reset down to 0, which again, you cannot kind of directly lose the threat. Now, one of them does hurt the Avengers Tower, and if that gets destroyed, which you cannot heal it, it's game over. So you can lose by these schemes going over, but you kind of have a couple of times you can potentially do it. It will vary between solo and multiplayer. Solo, it can be a little bit punishing. Multiplayer, it's super, super easy, and it's very hard to get the tower destroyed. So long story short here is that one of the main schemes in tower defense is kind of ignorable, and the other one is completely ignorable, which has a lot of shades of a Wrecking Crew. So while I do think the side schemes, might have been better off being like kind of a main scheme somehow, they're still slightly flawed in the same way here. But I do love tower defense. I think it's really thematic, really different to try and protect this tower. I hope they explore it more in the future. I'd love to do evolution of tower defense specifically, because we could kind of see this evolve into things like Sabretooth, where we're protecting Robert Kelly. There are things which are similar and encounter cards which are similar, but not quite relevant for this video, at least yet, maybe. But this is where we are at the moment with the kind of scheme situation, which they seem to have experimented with a lot, but maybe couldn't perfect yet. Although, a quick note, the Armies of Thanos here actually becomes Ancient Ritual from Clan Akaba from the Age of Apocalypse most recent expansion, because when the Armies of Thanos goes over, it's an encounter card for everyone. When Ancient Ritual goes over, it's an encounter card for everyone. Slight differences, but very inspired in my opinion. We can also see the Wrecking Crew side schemes kind of become the side schemes in the Four Horsemen, which is also from the Age of Apocalypse box. So we have Wrecker's side scheme here, which says deal 2 damage to a friendly character when the threat goes over. And then we have the Spectre of Death, which, when defeated, deals 1 damage to each character the player controls, which isn't exactly the same, but it is pretty similar how we have a side scheme which does damage, a side scheme which does damage. Maybe this is a stretch, this is a coincidence, and on its own, I would say yes. But let's look at the other Wrecking Crew side schemes and the other Four Horsemen side schemes. We see Clear the Road, Bulldozers, about discarding cards, match up with a Time of Famine, which when defeated, player discards 10 cards as well. And we have Pile Drivers, which is, discard an upgrade or support. And guess what? That is exactly what... I actually haven't got the name on screen, but I think it's Wars, Ravages of War, removes an upgrade or support they control as well from that side scheme. So the Wrecking Crew really became the Horsemen almost 1-to-1. You can match up each Horseman basically with one of the Wrecking Crew pretty much. So I think that's very, very interesting how they've kept that Wrecking Crew design and really built off of it. They really liked it, wasn't quite right, and they've tried to make it work. And in some ways, these side schemes in Four Horsemen, they're the most boring kind of scheme we've seen in these multi-villain ones, right? Because they're just normal side schemes now. They've kind of devolved back to normal side schemes. At the same time, they work. They are the most functional by far. So it's kind of sad to say it, but I prefer the Four Horsemen side schemes. I just think the way the schemes here for each of the characters works, they don't feel that special. They mostly just come out of the encounter deck, but they work. And the threat works in that scenario, which I think is very, very important, as it's a fundamental part of the game's, architecture. We even see these Wrecking Crew side schemes kind of evolve through other places, because we looked at Famine's side scheme, but this is kind of just Famine's ability as well. So Clear the Roads, discard 10 cards kind of, effect, kind of became the ability on a hero rather than just a side scheme that the hero would trigger when scheming enough. And then we kind of got Electro from Sinister Six, which is actually kind of at the middle point in terms of release dates. We had Wrecking Crew, we had a couple of expansions and things, then Electro in Sinister Motives, another couple of expansions, then we had Four Horsemen. Electro discard 7 instead of 10 cards, but we really see that discard, a bunch of cards effect go into another multi-villain scenario, and then another one. You can argue, other scenarios make you discard, but what other villain or, permanent schemes continue making you discard 10? And it's only really these kind of characters. We see this as well with Pile Driver side scheme again. We've got Craven, who makes you discard an upgrade or support, and War as well. So you really do see that all these effects carry through very directly. Yes, you'll have to discard upgrades and things in other scenarios, but as part of the abilities from sort of the villain or villain, tied side schemes, not really. Most of these multi-villain scenarios are just like normal scenarios. Get the villains down to 0 HP and you win. But Sinister Six is a little bit different because you have to forge your way out. You have to defeat this side scheme, which is really interesting. This is kind of the same as the main scheme from Collector 2, also known as Escape from the Museum, which is its proper name, but we'll call it Collector 2. And you're thwarting the main scheme, and when it gets to 0, you move on to the next main scheme, and you basically just have to get the main schemes to 0 each time to progress positively through the main schemes. Here, Sinister Six has its own main scheme, and instead has side schemes which you're trying to get through. But it's the same kind of idea. And while other than that, it's a little bit different, the villain design themselves, you can see that Collector has evolved into all the Sinister Six. So Collector, when defeated, he's got this interrupt. When he would be defeated, instead, flip the card, remove threat from the main scheme. With the Sinister Six, when defeated, it's remove threat from a side scheme. So defeat Collector, remove threat from main scheme, and that's how you win the game. With Sinister Six, you remove threat from the side scheme when they're defeated, and it's through a side scheme that you win the game. So not really multi-villain to multi-villain here, but I did think this was worth a mention. And also, we have the way the encounter cards work. So in the Sinister Six, there were a lot of encounter cards that did different things depending on which villains were in play. And this isn't something we had really seen before, but this is carried through to Mansion Attack, which is not in this category per se. It has, it's what I'm calling a dynamic villain scenario, but they are kind of related. They are, kind of almost like siblings, in that scenario style. So we also see that carry through to On the Run, which kind of is its own thing because there's only ever one villain, but it could be any of several, and you don't know until you're into the scenario. But it is interesting how this design, as far as I can see, started in Sinister Six. So the big points I think that change up in the multi-villain scenarios are how you handle the villains and defeating them. I think it's really, really interesting to see how they went here because you can really see kind of the pattern when you look into it. You've got the Wrecking Crew. They have a bunch of health. When defeated, though, they are gone. They are fully defeated and they are not coming back. They are no longer relevant to the scenario whatsoever. They went the complete opposite way with Tower Defense. When you defeat either Proxima or Corvus, nothing happens. They cannot actually be defeated while the other one has hit points. So you can get them to, basically 0 health, but they're still, alive and acting as if they had 100 health. It doesn't really matter. So with Wrecking Crew, you defeat one, it's completely gone. It changes the game significantly. With Tower Defense, they basically just have a shared health bar, and it kind of matters who you hit, but it also kind of doesn't matter who you hit. And I kind of feel like the Tower Defense method, where they're never actually defeated until they're both defeated, kind of unsatisfying because it doesn't feel like, oh, I target this guy, take this guy out. It just doesn't feel like there's two of them in that capacity, although it does feel like there are two overall. I'd still say I think it's maybe not the best move, and it's interesting that I feel like I've been quite negative about Tower Defense, but I really like that scenario. I think it's very fun. I like their abilities. Then we have the Sinister Six though, which is very, very different. Kind of like the Wrecking Crew in that they're defeated when they're defeated, but they have very little health and they're popping in and out. So you could defeat the same villain in that scenario like 3 times, but defeating it does get rid of it. It is impactful, and I think that's really fun. So compared to like the permanent defeat and then nothing, or compared to just the defeat not really mattering until they're both defeated, Sinister Six to me is much more satisfying. I think it's a great move. I think it's much more fun because it feels like you've made a difference. But one of the downsides with Wrecking Crew is the scenario is basically becoming progressively less interesting because there are just less and less things that make it a multi-villain scenario. With Sinister Six, they're jumping in and out. And I will say in solo play, normally I defeat one, nothing happens. The villain phase rolls around and another one comes out, I defeat it. And unless I get the right encounter card, it's kind of a single villain scenario sometimes. Whereas in multiplayer, you're getting a lot more encounter cards. You're seeing them hop in and out a lot more. I think that's more fun. So maybe it's not perfect yet, but I think it is a really good scenario. I really like Sinister Six scenario as well. When that Sinister Motives first came out, it was my favorite from the box. Now I don't quite think so, but it's still very, very good and fun. Next up, we have the Four Horsemen, which kind of hybrids the approach of the Sinister Six and Wrecking Crew. There are 4 villains on the board all at once, but the order changes up. And that's also the same with Sinister Six, actually. You never know what villain you're going to start with, who's going to hop in, whereas with Wrecking Crew and Tower Defense, it's always set. With the Four Horsemen, it's also kind of set, but they could be in a different order. And that can really affect you, especially at the start of the game. Starting on one that gets rid of an upgrade, for example, is going to feel terrible when you're trying to set up. I really don't like fighting war, although I do like fighting war. I love the Four Horsemen scenario. But it's really interesting that, it's a set villains, you know who you're going to fight, but you don't know what order they will activate against you, especially with the way the encounter cards can move that active token around as well. So that's really fun. The active thing on Wrecking Crew, completely able to manipulate it. Tower Defense is just back and forth, very static. With the Sinister Six, it actually goes in the activation order. Each of them have a number, so if the same villains are out on the board, you will know which order they're activating, but if different villains are not there, it will kind of just skip them because they're not present. So it's kind of more unpredictable, and Four Horsemen kind of, I think, does that as well. It's unpredictable, although you can kind of see the set order that it might be for the most part until things mess with it. I think both Sinister Six and the Four Horsemen do it really well. I think they do it better than the old ones. I think Four Horsemen probably does it best. But the Sinister Six do have another flaw that I haven't mentioned, actually, is that their force response, which is what moves the active counter, only works if they damage you. So tough cards, stun cards, block with an ally, doesn't move, which becomes very easy to keep it on a weak one or just, not see any of those effects happen, which is kind of a downer. It's kind of, I don't think that's great. So that's probably the weakest part of Sinister Six for me. Over to the Four Horsemen, and they fix that completely. Whatever happens, happens, no matter if they hit an ally, if they damage you or hit a tough. Though stuns and confuse do still work against them, I think they are kind of so brutal in a way. I think they're designed that, yeah, they're going to hurt you really hard. You better stun and you better confuse them. It feels like they're designed to work with that. Kind of like the Mojo Mania scenarios, which we won't talk about much here, but I really feel like these are scenarios where the design is for, okay, stun and confuse exist. Let's design them to be balanced even in that kind of world, rather than use steady or stalwart, to completely block them out or whatever. So that's really, really interesting. So War and the Horsemen, they are activating in a different order each game, but once you're in the game, you kind of know the order, but it will change up based on encounter cards. I just think that's really, really good design and really fun. And here's the interesting thing. So going back to Wrecking Crew, they're just completely defeated. Tower defense, not at all. Well, with the Four Horsemen, although it mimics Wrecking Crew a lot, when one of them goes down to 0, their abilities are offline. So they're kind of still there, but not there. They are half present. And that's really, really fascinating, because getting 1 to 0 hit points is impactful because it weakens them, because those abilities are extremely annoying on them. They're forced responses that, make you discard or lose an upgrade or, take damage to your characters. So it's meaningful, but they're still in play. So the scenario retains its more interesting nature as a multi-villain scenario better than Wrecking Crew, especially because some of the encounter cards, give them extra health back. They kind of resurrect their abilities, so they might sort of jump back in a little bit like Sinister Six, but you can kind of remove those not too, without too much difficulty, which is also kind of like the Sinister Six. So for me, looking at these multi-villain scenarios, I definitely think Four Horsemen is the best of them by far. Now, for some people, they do think it's too difficult, and I will say there is an argument to be made that it's the hardest one in the box as a second scenario. It varies, it will vary based on your deck and different factors. For me, I don't think they are quite the hardest, but they are up there, and that's pretty crazy. So kind of like the boss of the multi-villains, but also the best of the multi-villains is my opinion on the Four Horsemen. And we can look at it go something a little bit like this. So Wrecking Crew is where it begins. It goes to Tower Defense, it goes to Sinister Six, and mostly Four Horsemen is an evolution of Wrecking Crew with elements of the others mixed in and different improvements made to every different kind of area. But what's really interesting is how the things from the other scenarios kind of spin off in their own way as well, which I think is fun. And we'll see that probably happen again when we look at what I'm calling dynamic villain scenarios. What are the dynamic villain scenarios? We looked at the multi-villain ones, I listed them out, and what are the dynamic ones? Well, some people would say it's just Mansion Attack and Morlock Siege, and some people would say they're just part of multi-villain scenarios, but they don't act the same. There's one villain at a time on the board, and it doesn't change that often, honestly. So I don't think they count at all like the other ones. You kind of have your set enemy, and it's going to be your set enemy until you defeat it, and that's what triggers bringing in another one. So what is the first dynamic villain scenario in the game? Well, I think this formula has already been done before, and people didn't really notice it. I think most people don't think of this as a multi-villain scenario, but let's talk about Kang. Yes, all the villains are different Kangs, okay? I will admit, it's Kang. You're fighting Kang, and then you're fighting Kang. But they are different Kangs. They are very different Kangs. So this one scheme 3 attack villain can just get 3 scheme or 1 scheme. It can go to 2 attack or 4 attack. Those are big meaningful changes. Even before we look at their abilities, one kind of gets, basically guard from all minions. The other one has piercing on their attacks. These are significant changes, which are, to me, more different than some other villains in the game. Let's take a look at these. This is Arclight and Chimera, hopefully I'm saying that right, from the Marauders, from, On the Run and Morlock Siege, which we'll be talking about soon. And they've got the same stats. Their abilities are exactly the same, except for one of the bullet points. To me, these are very, very similar. And to me, the Kangs are more different. And, Morlock Siege, defeat a villain, another one comes in. Guess what? I defeat Kang, we move to a different phase, and I'm fighting a different Kang. So I 100% think Kang counts. Next up, I need to talk about Loki, because here's another scenario where all the villains, plural, debatable, have the same name. All the villain cards have the same name. And when they change out, it changes the scenario drastically. 1 scheme, 3 attack, and Stalwart is very different from 2 scheme, 1 attack, retaliate. You can punish, attacking and retaliate with your allies, or if you're hitting it with a tough, or if you're a low hit point character. Whereas with Stalwart, if you're, a character that brings a lot of stuns and things, that's really punishing you. And you have to play around these differently. As differently, I would say, as any of the Wrecking Crew or anything in that realm. So I 100% think Loki is in the conversation here and is part of the sort of dynamic villain scenarios, just like Morlock Siege or Mansion Attack. And it's interesting, we can kind of see how they evolved, because Kang has this effect, the villain cannot take damage while a minion is in play. Loki says cannot take damage while a side scheme is in play. It's a very similar effect, and you see different stats on different ones of these as well. So I definitely think there's some inspiration, even just between these sort of progenitors of what most people consider these, stacking multi-villain kind of what I'm calling dynamic villain scenarios. So if we add Kang and Loki to this list, which some people will disagree with, I know they will, but I believe this is, kind of the origins of this kind of, archetype, quote unquote, of, style of scenario. But where do we go after that? Well, this is where it becomes a little bit more debatable, even more than, Kang and Loki for me, because I would say it's Mr. Sinister and Dark Beast. And I know what you're thinking. They do not change at all in terms of their identity cards. You're fighting stage 1 at Mr. Sinister, and then stage 2, or to stage 2 and then stage 3. If you're playing on expert, it's just that villain. You're not even swapping the identity card out for a different one. So how could they be, multi-villains? Well, I'm not saying they're multi-villains. I'm saying they're dynamic villain scenarios. So Mr. Sinister gets a kind of a superpower attachment at the beginning of the game, and then he gets the second one in. There are 3 total. He will see 2 out of the 3 each time, which means you don't know which one he's going to start with. You don't know which one he's going to get, and you will have good replayability because there'll be one you haven't seen, and they can come in different orders, which would also change how you approach different parts of the scenario, which has a lot of the same benefits of the other dynamic villain scenarios. We've not really talked about, Morlock Siege and Mansion Attack yet, which are kind of the main ones I will be talking about. But I think some of the best part of these, and even, Sinister Six and, Horseman, there's a lot of replayability in the way things are different when you play them. It's not just, the same villain doing the same thing every time. And in that vein, I think Mr. Sinister totally counts. So like Mr. Sinister starts with that attachment, and when the main scheme advances, he'll get a different one. Dark Beast starts with an environment, and when he advances, not his main scheme, but when he is advanced by taking damage and, his first stage is defeated, brings in a different one, which will change up the scenario. It's not as big of a deal because they don't increase his stats, but just like Mr. Sinister's super strength gives him steady, Genosha will give Dark Beast steady. We have telepathy, which gives Mr. Sinister retaliate, just like Savage Lands will give Dark Beast retaliate. So you can kind of see the direct evolution there and how it does change up those scenarios. I think it changes how you approach them when you go into it. I think it changes how you approach them further on in the scenario. I think when you start to play the scenario, you have no idea, and you have to adapt as you go, which is kind of the advantage and fun thing of Morlock Siege, Mansion Attack. It's a fun part of the second bit of Kang, and Loki. People don't particularly love that scenario in general, but I do think it's interesting having to adapt to the different Lokis. I actually like that part of it, if I dissect it down. So I think these count personally. Your opinion may differ, and that's completely fine, but hopefully I've convinced you they're at least in the same ballpark. I think they are all dynamic villain scenarios. So now we have at least most of our dynamic villain scenarios, and let's get into the meat of this. We need to talk about Mansion Attack. Stack of villains, shuffle them up, whoever's on the top of that's who you're fighting, defeat one, then the next one on the stack is who you're fighting. So there are 4 of them, but you'll only ever fight 3 in a scenario. You have to defeat 3 to win. I can't remember if that's just expert or everything, because basically only play it on expert. But, because with Loki's you have to defeat a different amount of them, which is kind of how you can see how this design has followed on from that. It's very, very similar, which to me is another kind of, piece of evidence that they're basically the same thing design-wise, in terms of how we talk about these. And I think it's really fun because, again, it's the replayability thing, kind of how we can see that evolve off into the attachments for Sinister and Dark Beast. You will see a certain amount of them, most of them, but not all of them, and in different orders, which will change up how you approach things at different times. What Mansion Attack does incredibly well, which I think is the most fun part of it in that regard, is that also the main schemes change as well. So depending on what the main scheme is, it can define how you approach things. Each character gains 1 retaliate. So if the villain has retaliate, attacking with your allies is not such a good idea. If they've got steady, stun's not such a good idea. You're adapting in the same ways. But what's interesting in this scenario is that these effects are just like Storm's weather effects. They affect everyone globally. So actually, even your hero will get retaliate. So they will hit you, and they will take damage, which again changes how you might approach things or let attacks hit different targets. So I actually love Mansion Attack as a scenario. If Mansion Attack was to have a downside, I'd say that it's certain villains and certain side schemes and certain combinations are worse than others. So you can have a lot easier times sometimes, starting with Blob with a really, relaxed scenario, main scheme. That's completely fine. Whereas Toad and Pyro are very annoying. They're going to chip you down kind of thing. So there is higher variance than normal here, but it's not a huge deal. I quite like the different, approaches you can take here. So overall, I think the way that they sort of match up and change is a huge, huge strength. And what's quite interesting as well, as we saw kind of how some of the Wrecking Crew became some of the Sinister Six, which became some of the Horsemen, we can see some of the other Sinister Six kind of became the Mansion Attack characters, because Hobgoblin will make you take indirect damage after he attacks, so will Pyro. Vulture will make you discard a card from hand, so will Toad. And I think that kind of thing is really interesting. Scorpion, Blob with the stun. And you might say, oh, this is just, coincidence. There's so many villains. Of course, it's going to overlap, but it's multiple villains overlapping with multiple villains from, just two scenarios, one to the other. And I kind of feel like that's irrefutable. So that's definitely evolution. And I don't think it's bad at all. Fighting Blob doesn't remind me of fighting Scorpion, so it's fine. And I think the indirect damage from Hobgoblin, which I think is like the pumpkin bombs, and Pyros is the fire. That's how it gets around your defenses. I think that makes sense. I think it's all thematic in different ways. Really good use of those tools. Speaking of those main schemes in Mansion Attack, we can kind of trace their origin, I think, to the Hood. It comes with a modular set called Streets of Mayhem, which is a really weird but fun modular set, which has these permanent sort of environments that come in, and they give every character retaliate or plus attack, just like the Mansion Attack main schemes. And as I mentioned, they kind of then became, in my opinion, Storm's weather deck. So it kind of went from modular set to scenario to hero, sort of effect. And that's kind of interesting in its own way, how these all inspire each other. We can also see how the Mansion Attack main schemes kind of become the attachments for Mr. Sinister. One gives steady, Mr. Sinister can get steady, so you can kind of see the evolution happen that way as well. And it happens the same with the basketball court, with giving each ally and minion toughness. That's another main scheme from Mansion Attack. Kind of becomes the Mojo Runner environment, the one of these cards which comes into play when you play Mojo or Spiral in the Mojo Mania scenario pack. And it kind of begs the question to me, are Spiral or even Mojo dynamic villain scenarios? Because they get these cards that come in that change up the scenario. But for me, well, they might be maybe dynamic scenarios because of the different environments that they can kind of naturally have in from the beginning. They are not dynamic villain scenarios because I don't think the villains change enough. Now, we can see that there are two different forms of Spiral, and one cannot attack, the other has free attack, which is a huge difference. But to me, it's more like an on and off switch. The villain is active or the villain is inactive, as opposed to the villain changing. And when it does change, you know exactly what it's changing to, which makes it predictable in a way that none of these other scenarios are. Yes, carrying stage 2 to stage 3, you know what stage 3 will be, but the stage 2 will be different, most times you play it. So for my money, Spiral doesn't count, but is closely related to this kind of thing. Similar for Mojo, but a little bit less for him too, because he doesn't even have the on and off kind of stage. It's just the environments which are going to be changing a lot. And yes, you can add these modulars to other villains, but they don't kind of change out as reliably as in Spiral or the Mojo scenario, which I think is a point kind of in their favor as being particularly different, but not different enough to be dynamic villain scenarios. Next up is Morlock Siege, which I want to talk about, which is kind of a mix of Mansion Attack and Sabretooth. So Mansion Attack, different villains in a stack. Sabretooth, you have to defend an ally. Morlock Siege, stack of villains which change while you're defending an ally. And it's really, really fun. When we did the podcast, Shadow of the Cast, me and Nelson, and we talked about the next evolution scenarios, I said Morlock Siege was my favorite. Now, that's not true nowadays. I guess it's kind of like Sinister Six, the multi-villain fun kind of maybe slightly wore off, but it's kind of just a little bit too easy. That is the biggest downside I can say about Morlock Siege, but everything else I think is extremely fun. So we can look at some of the villains who are, maybe a little bit similar to each other, but that was just cherry picking as an example to say how different, the Lokis are or the Kangs are, because some of the villains are very, very different. Some add on a bunch of threats, some do a bunch of damage, some have overkill, all these different effects, some have piercing. So the villain you fight in Morlock Siege is significant. Fortunately, the health isn't so high that, usually if one is problematic, you can kind of rush it down and get a different one in. So that's good. And that's basically it. So there is some variety there. I do quite like it, but it doesn't have the different main scheme as well, like Mansion Attack so arguably not as replayable, except you have to consider there are 7 different Marauders, which means you could do the scenario twice and never see the same villain once. And as you can see, Proxima Midnight from Tower Defense makes you make a choice when they attack. So do all of the Marauders, but also kind of so does Kang, in his stage 1 and 3. So I do kind of think there's some inspiration here. I don't think choosing something when they attack is too unique to multi-villain scenarios, but I would say they use it way more than most. If you took all the scenarios in the game, and multi-villain scenarios are like, what, 10% of our scenarios? Dynamic villains scenarios, if you include those, it's like 10%, 15% at most. But they have, I don't know, maybe 70 to 80% of these scenarios where you have to make a choice when the villain attacks built into them. Next up, as I sort of mentioned, you have to defend an ally in Sabretooth, you have to defend an ally in Morlock Siege, but actually in solo play, you get 2 of them, and in 2-player, you get 2 of them, in 3-player, 3, and 4-player, 4. It's kind of a weird thing between 1 and 2-player, where I think this is because in solo play, they didn't want it to be too swingy. They didn't want you to have just one 5 HP ally, and oh, bad luck, it got attacked, you lost the game. So they give you 2, but it's the same amount as in 2-player. And what this means is that in solo play, you have just so many hit points on those Morlocks, and they generally come in with tough, unless you do really bad at the first kind of part of the scenario, because there's kind of a delay, you don't start with them in play. When they come into play, you get 2 allies with 5 HP and tough. It's very hard for them to get defeated. That's like worst case 4 attacks, best case 6 attacks that they're going to take from the villain, which is, only going to happen if you do a really bad job of defending. I think Robert Kelly was a little bit irritating in many ways. Sabretooth had some feel bad effects, like his healing as well. Like, you have to defend someone, but then the villain heals, so, it's kind of slowing you down from 2 different angles, whereas Morlock Siege, it's kind of speeding you up from every angle, if I'm honest. They kind of protect themselves for the most part, for half of it at least. So, yeah, that's kind of a little bit strange, but I do love it as a scenario. You kind of have these counters on the main scheme, not counters. The villains are breaking through to get to the Morlocks, which I think is really, really fun. I just quickly want to talk about On the Run, which is a very similar scenario to Morlock Siege. You start the game getting a random Marauder in as the villain, but that Marauder never changes. Its health will increase, maybe its stats will increase, but not in a massively significant way more than any other scenario. Where you knock the villain from stage 2 to 3, and stats increase, health increases. It's just kind of simulating it, so you don't know what villain you'll fight going into it. So it does have a kind of a big replayability thing as well. With those 7 villains. But it doesn't change during the scenario, and there's not multiple villains out, so I don't think it fits these categories, but it is fun to talk about. Something I think it does better, though, is it rewards you with different effects from the encounter deck based on what villains are out, compared to, say, Morlock Siege, or even some of the other, quote-unquote, dynamic, multi-villain scenarios, because if Arclight is out, you can see here with Dizzying Deeds, there's a stun, but if it's Riptide, take 3 damage. And if it's Vertigo, it's a Confuse. Confuse and Stun, 2 sides of the same coin, they're very different, but taking damage, such a different effect from a status card that I think, that's just really interesting. And you can have multiple out at once because they are minions, You could have the minion of Arclight out while Riptide is your villain. That means this encounter card has so many different combinations of what it can do. I would love to see more multi-villain or dynamic villain scenarios where the encounter cards change based on who is out. I think you could put basically every card in the encounter deck changing that way, but I really like how On the Run does it. And what's really interesting is that Morlock Siege will have different villains throughout the scenario, but it doesn't have any cards like Dizzying Deeds. One of the other weak points of Morlock Siege is that, yeah, there are different villains in the stack, but the encounter cards are basically always the same no matter who you have out, because they're focused on the Morlocks and not on the villains, whereas On the Run lets the villains shine more. So ultimately, I prefer On the Run, though I don't think it technically fits into either of the categories we're discussing today. So does this bring us to the end of our dynamic villain journey, starting at Kang through to Loki, through to Mansion Attack, with inspirations, from Sinister Six, Streets of Mayhem going out there, and we can see how something like goes into Mr. Sinister, Morlock Siege, Dark Beast, On the Run. It's really interesting how these things kind of go. I probably should have put an arrow from Mansion Attack to Mr. Sinister, as I do think there is a through line that kind of that you can follow there. However, there is one more villain we haven't discussed that I think deserves a place here. Probably more than Dark Beast, at least as much, if not more than Mr. Sinister. Very reminiscent of Loki, if you agree that Loki fits here, which I think he does. And that is going to be Apocalypse. So we can look at Loki, Retaliate 1, 2 Scheme. Well, guess what? Apocalypse has a form with more Scheme than his other stats, and Retaliate. We could look at Loki with 3 Attack and Stalwart, and then look at Apocalypse with 3 Attack and Stalwart. And just like with Loki's, changing about, you flip his card about and different side schemes will change that and things, which is also reminiscent of Loki. So in some ways, En Saboneur is the best parts of Loki refined. And I think that's why En Saboneur is my favorite scenario from the Age of Apocalypse book. So it's very, very close with Apocalypse, and I really like Four Horsemen as well. So a lot of good stuff in that box, as you guys will know if you've watched my recent stuff. But it's interesting really how similar this is when you think about it. And we can even look at this from another angle, because we've got Mr. Sinister here, and he's got telepathy, which is +1 scheme and retaliate. When Apocalypse changes to his, scheming form, it's higher scheme and retaliate. We've got flight here, which is +1 attack and overkill. And then we've got Apocalypse's form with more attack and overkill. So kind of Loki became Apocalypse, kind of in my opinion, or Apocalypse evolved from Loki. But it also kind of evolved from Mr. Sinister, or they both kind of evolved separately but shared some traits. They're probably designed around the same time. Tony came onto the team. This was his first expansion with Next Evolution, which is what the Mr. Sinister stuff is from. And then after that, we've got Age of Apocalypse from Caleb, lead designer on that. So that's really, really interesting. I'm sure they work together on that, and I think these things make sense. I think if you're boosting the attack, overkill is something that is going to work off that. But it is interesting and fun to me to see how this kind of worked out. Ultimately, that's what I think about these scenarios. We've looked at multi-villain scenarios and dynamic villain scenarios. I definitely think the multi-villain scenarios improved over time. Four Horsemen, though, I think it's a really good kind of, pinnacle of the multi-villain design. Although I still think they can improve upon it. I think there's a lot of, not even necessarily improve upon it, although I do think they can, obviously, but a lot of untapped potential. Dynamic villain scenarios, I kind of feel the same way. I think there's even kind of a world where maybe it's a fusion. Maybe there's one villain out, and then there's two, then there's one. That might sound like Sinister Six, but maybe in a slightly more controlled manner, so it's kind of a dynamic villain scenario that turns into a multi-villain scenario, or vice versa. I think you could have like 2 lieutenants out of a possible 5, and that could lead on to one of 2 possible bosses, for example, that you fight any one of them. There's so many different ways and arrangements you could do any and all of this that I think it's really exciting for the future. I hope they continue to do more. I am 99.999% certain they will, because there's so much potential and there's so many comic book characters. This is a great way to include more of them. Although, shout out Sinister Six, where's my Doc Ock scenario? That should have been standalone, and I will not be happy until we have a worthy Dr. Octopus scenario. And honestly, a lot of those villains in there could be their own scenario. So really hoping for more Spider stuff in the future. I'm sure everyone pretty much is, unless you just don't like Spider stuff, which is unlikely if you're playing a Marvel game. But there'll be one person out there in the comments, and I'll look for your comment, trust me on that. If you want to comment, let me know on anything you agree or disagree with, anything else you've noticed. We're going to continue with more villain videos in the future. Going to do a lot of analysis, modular set stuff. It's just working up to it. I want it to all be perfect and interact with each other and like be usable, how I reference difficulties and ways that you can just make it really usable and make sense. Hopefully that made sense. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.